Breaking news just now. The State Department has just announced that one American was killed in that hotel terror attack in Mali. Of course, Westerners were the target in Mali, and the stakes are climbing in the race for terror supremacy between ISIS and al-Qaeda, both becoming more brazen and much more deadly. And the failure of intelligence and PC concerns making the West more vulnerable than it has to be. We'll address that. In the stock market soars this week, sending a message about America's resolve and hinting at a year-end rally. Making Money starts right now. Breaking news just a week after the para-terrorist attack, terrorist strike yet again. The latest target, a luxury hotel in Mali, Africa. Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists storming the Radisson Blu Hotel today, killing right now, the count is 19 people. They held as many as 170 hostage, and now we are learning that one of those killed is indeed an American citizen. The State Department just now releasing this statement, quote, "We can confirm the death of a U.S. citizen in the attack on the Radisson Hotel in Bamako, Mali, which is the capital. We express our deepest condolences to the family and the friends of the deceased." Now, we are providing all possible consular assistance out of respect for the family. We have no further information at this time. The siege for now is over. Mali Special Forces entering the hotel, freeing the hostages floor by floor, trapping the terrorists at the top of the floor, the number one floor at the top. Now, among those freed were at least a dozen Americans. Remember, Mali is a former French colony, and the hotel, of course, is the perfect symbol for Western success. Joining me now, Stephen Yates, former Cheney Deputy National Security Advisor, Steve Rogers, former Senior Military Intel Officer for the FBI, National Joint Terrorism Task Force, and Kathy Taylor, former National Security Council Director. Kathy, I'll go to you first. Just an absolute horrific scene there, and this is one of these things where we know it's getting worse. It's getting these are coming closer and closer together.
It is, and let's first echo the condolences for sure. This was a really tragic day. But as you said, Charles, it is just increasing at a rate that is alarming. Now, here, this was not ISIS. It seems to have been, at this point, an al-Qaeda-linked group who's kind of doubling down on the message to the French to say, hey, we're tough too. We can create havoc too. But nonetheless, the number of attacks in such a short period of time, the number of folks killed raises such a question as to what we're going to do about our policy.
You know, here's the thing that I don't get to a certain degree, Steve. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, has been the target of so much terrorist violence. In Mali, just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, ISIS almost took over that country. French forces had to come and sort of free it. And here's the irony. This is they have a democratically elected president, and they're trying to do the right things there. And ISIS, I guess, thinks that maybe something like this could be the one you wedge away from the West.
Well, you know what, Charles? Apparently our leaders haven't heard the saying, if you don't learn from history, history's bound to repeat itself. When I was a kid, I remember looking at World War II movies, and you'd see the map of Europe. And boy, the Nazis would be marching. ISIS is doing the same thing today. They have their grips in the Mideast. Now they have their grips in Europe. They have their grips in Africa. And guess what? They're going to have their grips here if we don't wake up.
You know, Stephen Yates, I remember during the Bush-Cheney presidency when Darfur was a center of a lot of, massacre and horrific scenes. And the press was unrelenting on you guys. It was racism. It was everything else. And here we have it now where the body count under President Obama in Africa and other places because of terrorism has gone through the roof.
It has. Obviously, with the destabilization of Libya, things spilled over, and there have been problems in the near abroad to its south. There's been travesties everywhere from Nigeria and across the continent, really. And what it really is, though, what we're seeing is this remains a global movement. What we're seeing is a dramatic reach of these groups. We've tried to slice the salami about whether it's ISIS, al-Qaeda. We focus on geographies like Iraq and Syria. But really, this is global reach. They're hitting Europe. They're hitting the African continent. They're threatening us. They have reach into Asia. It's a real serious global problem.
So then, Stephen, this brings back that statement that President Obama made, unfortunately, a week ago today, just an hour or so before the Paris attack, that ISIS was, quote, contained. It feels like that they're anything but contained. And in many cases, it feels like we're actually looking the other way.
Well, we are too often looking the other way. I think there's really no appetite in the part of the administration to really engage the threat abroad. There's an understandable political desire on the part of most Americans not to deploy a lot of troops to a lot of different places. But what we can't deny is that these groups have chosen to declare war on Western civilization and us. We didn't get a vote in that. And so if we're going to have a role in the world, if our allies are going to trust us and rely upon us, we have to be there to support them when they're under threat like this.
Kathy, I think, Steve, you just make this point about just looking at a map, understanding, you go with Germany and you take out Czechoslovakia, you take out Poland, everyone looks the other way. You have a guy like a Neville Chamberlain. Don't worry, these guys are not going to go any further. This is it. History is repeating itself to a large degree.
It absolutely is. We've had over 280 terrorist attacks of some way, shape, or form in the world this year so far.
280.
Over. Yes, I mean, it might be a kidnapping, it may be a small event. Most of them don't get reported. They're not of the scale and nature. Happening all over the world, from Africa to the Philippines. It's completely uncontained. And we're not fighting a war in the way that we need to be fighting a war. By definition, a non-state actor has no borders, means it cannot be contained. And so we need to change the way we're fighting and the way that we're dealing with this.
President Obama says it's a war of ideology and it's going to take maybe 10 or 20 years, Steve.
Well, but she's absolutely right. It's a different type of war. The global reach is right into our neighborhoods. We've got to get the American people involved. We've got to get our police, local police involved. Earlier on Fox, they were talking about how intelligence now needs to be strengthened between local law enforcement and the military. Look, we're not fear-mongering here. This is reality. This is war. We've got to fight it like a war.
And here's another thing about this, guys, that we've got to talk about, because we know ISIS, they're always in the news, particularly over the last year or so. But today, this was an al-Qaeda-linked terror attack. And I got to tell you, both groups are now competing for recruits. We can only from here probably see these attacks become greater with respect to death toll. In fact, look at this chart. I want you to look at the end of this chart. You see that spike? Those are the numbers of mass murders attributed to terrorism. A gigantic spike. In fact, in the last year, there were more than 25 attacks where more than 100 people were killed in a single day. And these terrorists, of course, we just talked about, is striking all over the world. It is a global war. The casualties are mounting. Stephen Yates, how do we fight a global war when we won't even acknowledge it?
Well, you can't. If you're not going to name the enemy, you can't really define the mission or a strategy to try to roll it back. You also can't do it alone. And that's one of the most damaging things in recent years is the inability of our allies to know that we're a reliable partner that will provide them the means to help them defend themselves. And when called upon, we'll stand with them. It's extremely terrible that in the wake of the Paris attack, we didn't even really consider Article 5 of the NATO treaty agreement as the French had invoked immediately after 9/11 when we were attacked. I mean, we've really degraded a notion of alliances. Without that, you really can't do anything global.
By the way, Stephen, could the French have invoked the Article 5 and would we have been obligated to step up to the plate?
The French could have pushed that. So could any other NATO member could have pushed that for an issue for discussion and put the pressure on the United States.
Here's the thing. We heard today that Germany has taken in 900,000 of these refugees. They'll probably crack 1 million this year. 1 million virtually unvetted refugees from these war-torn areas that we know contain ISIS operatives. You don't know how many, but it's just common sense. France still committed to 30,000, despite the carnage, despite declaring war on ISIS. They're committed to 30,000. So maybe we talk about an appetite for this fight that is global. I don't understand how we're going to ever contain it when we're kind of playing around with it on the fringes here.
Well, a couple of things that are very important because it is such a difficult challenge, right? I mean, that's an understatement. First of all, we need a foreign policy. We all know that. But we have a broken intel system.
How should the foreign policy look?
We don't have one.
No, but how should it look? I know we don't have one, but should we have one that's pretty clear cut? Take a page out of Vladimir Putin. Or maybe the old school Chicago thing. Come at me with a bat, I'll come at you with a gun.
It needs to have 4 things. It's not that complicated. It needs to have a clear mission with the support of the American people. Today, it came out that more than 70% of Americans support some action against ISIS. It needs to have a clear mission. It needs to have an intel component. We've had a weakened intel system over the last 7 years that is causing us a much weaker position in fighting this war right now. It needs to have a very clear immigration policy that we can actually enforce and adhere to. And it needs to have a diplomatic component. We need to work with the rest of the world, and we haven't done that.
And may I add, on top of that list, we need American leadership who's going to realize that this is a war. What we don't need is a Hillary Clinton stating to the world, this is not America's fight. Well, it is America's fight. And I challenge her or anybody who makes that statement, Charles, to look into the eyes of any American family who will suffer a catastrophic loss in the event that we get attacked. This is a war. Our leadership needs to define it as a war.
Steve, would you go as far as to saying right now that we are in the midst of World War III, that we are, in fact, de facto in a world war, and the longer we come to grips with this, that we don't come to grips with it, the worse it's going to be for us?
The same question was asked right before World War II, and I gave you the illustration and the map, and finally Winston Churchill woke up and said, you know what? We're in a world war.
And we had to wake up the hard way.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
And what's interesting is it's kind of like a game of Russian roulette right now. I mean, it's so hard to keep track of who's angry at who. Right? You had the Sunnis and the Shias, then you had al-Qaeda, now you have ISIS. We're backing some, not others. It's confusing. I think it's confusing to Americans. I think that in itself breeds fear. And we need to have a very clear policy that helps people understand what's really going on in the world.
This is where American leadership could stand tall if the president sits down with Putin, sits down with the president of France, and particularly those two nations, because they got hit, and the rest of our allies, and say, it's time to get the job done.
Stephen Yates, where does the Middle East come in on this? Our allies that have made trillions of dollars selling us oil, that have benefited from our cover for decades now, when do they step up to the plate? When does Saudi Arabia put some of its riches toward fighting this war instead of trying to bankrupt our frackers?
Well, from what I'm told by people who are close to this White House, which I am not, that the White House and some of its officials are basically discouraging some of our allies in the region from playing a larger role. They're trying to minimize our footprint and the impact on the Syrian civil war. So actually, I think there's actually some discouraging signals coming out of the current administration in terms of what our allies need. And in the broader Middle East, if you aren't willing to go big, everyone tells you to go home.
Well, speaking of going big, I got to get you guys, I want to ask every one of you. You saw that chart. When I saw that chart today, I fell out of my chair. I mean, I wanted to cry. Look at that. If you think about what happened in Paris as something that's going to be relatively routine, at what point do we need to see American city lose 100, 200, 300 people? And how possible, Stephen, how likely is that possible to happen?
I fear that we're at risk of this now. I think there's a great risk in 2016 of some kind of a mass casualty event happening in the United States. I hate to say that. I want to be optimistic about a presidential year and things turning for a brighter future and all of that. But right now, all of the signals that are given to our enemies right now are our window of opportunity. And if anything, if they listen to our debate and they believe that change is coming, they might worry that a harder policy would be put in place in 2017, making this near term their moment to strike.
Yeah, real quick, guys, we got to wrap it up. But the likelihood, Kathy, of a horrific incident like this happening in America real soon.
Well, I'll say two things to that quickly. First, so far, everything ISIS has said they're going to do over the last several weeks, they've done. They have said they're going to do something here. That does not give us a great sense of calm.
We'll leave it there, guys. Okay. I'm going to bring you all back anyway later on in the show. In the meantime, 2 Paris suicide bombers were fingerprinted in Greece on October 3rd, and a known terrorist suspect actually skipped his weekly check-ins with the police, and then he blew up a bunch of kids at a nightclub a week ago today. Failure of Western intelligence makes no sense. We'll discuss it when we come back.
Should there be a database system that tracks the Muslims here in this country?
There should be a lot of systems beyond database. I mean, we should have a lot of systems. And today you can do it. But right now we have to have a border, we have to have strength, we have to have a wall, and we cannot let what's happening to this country happen.
But that's something your White House would like to implement.
Oh, I would certainly implement that. Absolutely.
Donald Trump facing another media firestorm over allegedly supporting a federal database of American Muslims.
I'm a big fan of Donald Trump's, but I'm not a fan of government registries of American citizens. The First Amendment protects religious liberty, and I've spent the past several decades defending the religious liberty of every American. What I do think is important is that the federal government be far more vigorous going after radical Islamic terrorists.
That, of course, is a Trump rival, but something like a friend, maybe frenemies from here on out. Remember, Donald Trump today denying any support for such a policy. In fact, he tweeted, quote, "I didn't suggest a database. A reporter did. We must defeat Islamic terrorism and have surveillance, including a watch list to protect Americans." Ebony Williams, Kathy Taylor back with me. Trump fans, I got to also tell you guys, they came at me pretty hard today. We covered this yesterday. But I also think that to a certain degree, and Steve, you're back with us as well, that Donald Trump is going to have to be a little bit more careful. I mean, listen, the drive-by media has the GOP specifically in their scopes, and if it's ambiguous, then it's going to come out the wrong way.
Donald Trump is the John Wayne of the 21st century. We need a man like him who's going to stand up and tell it like it is. And the media is twisting and shaping the story. Charles, I never heard the word database come out of his mouth. However, he clarified later that he was talking about a watch list. He's talking about saving American lives.
But when someone says, are you open to a possible database or ID, and you say, if you don't say a definitive no, then you do leave yourself open to something, Kathy. Well, we know how people have been set up so far in this election.
He's left. They're interpreting what he said. Okay.
Oh, come on now. He kind of stepped in it. Now we just saw the footage, and look, I'm with Charles on this. There's a savviness, and this is where political inexperience rears its head. I think Trump's ran a fantastic campaign for where he's at so far, but as he gets further and further into this thing, he is going to have to step up his savviness and be able to see that coming from a mile away. That was a setup coming his way, and he stepped right into it.
But what he's done so well, and this is the power of Trump, like it or not, is that he has been able to put his finger on the pulse of what American people are thinking, but don't want to say, however un-PC it is, and then say it, and then over a course of a couple of weeks, dial it back to something a little more reasonable. Let's remember, just a few weeks ago, it was Trump who said, let Putin handle ISIS. Why should we be over there? And he's not saying that today.
All right, so here's the thing, guys. What about this issue? Because I tweeted it. I did a poll today where I'm approaching 1,000 people have taken this poll, and I just said, didn't put in presidential candidates, but should we demand that American Muslims have special identification? 54% said yes because the risks are too high. You said Donald Trump has a way of touching the American public. Is it something we don't want to talk about in polite society, but it may be something that a lot of people feel?
It's what a lot of people feel, but unfortunately, it's not the root of the problem. The problem is not Islam per se. It is these groups. And so a national registry, a national database doesn't really do anything, and he knows that. And freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom is at the core of America. It's at the core of the Republican Party.
Right, but here's the thing, Steve. We do protect things like hate speech. You can't. We do even have limitations with respect to the Constitution when it endangers the greater good.
Charles, in my view, Donald Trump believes, I think like many of us do, that we are going to be engaged in a war unlike anything we've ever seen before in the history of this country.
Are you okay with IDs?
I'm okay with IDs, yes, for individual groups, okay?
No, I'm talking about American Muslims. Do you think they all should have a special identification?
No. I do believe this, though. And I believe he believes this, okay? Not about all of them, but anyone who comes up on the radar, they should be watched and they should have special
I agree. I think Donald Trump was sandbagged.
Yes, he was.
But he's got to be careful. He's got to be careful. I got to tell you that right now. By the way, it was a huge week for the stock market. Western markets in general sent a message to the terrorists. But you know what? There might be another message in there, too, about where stocks go from here. We'll talk a little markets when we come back.